Do you find yourself running out of room on the page when you do a drawing? Do your portraits look like people have had their brain removed and the top of their head sewn on just above their eyeballs? Are you having trouble just getting things to look right? Well, guess what? I've got good news for you, because in this video I'm going to share with you some critical knowledge that's going to help you improve your drawing, and I'm going to share some techniques that you can use right now to get a better result. But just before I get into that, let me ask you a question. Are you finding these videos helpful? If so, please leave me a comment below and tell me what drawing problems you have that you'd like me to help you solve. I will make a future video and help you with your problem. Hit like now if you think that's a good idea. Now, I want to talk today about something called proportions. First, I'd like to give you some information on what proportions actually are. In a literal sense, it is the relative size of how big and little some things are to each other. For example, in this picture where I'm standing next to a tree, I'm quite small and the tree is quite big. Now, that's a very simple way of understanding what proportions are, but we can get a bit more precise than that. For example, if I draw this square, it has a certain size, and now I draw another square next to it, and now we've made this square twice the size of the first square. And we can use those two measurements to arrive at a ratio, and now we've got mathematics. If I have a square that is twice as big as the square next to it, then the ratio will be 2 to 1. Now, you didn't come here for a maths lesson, and I'm not the best person to give you one. So let's get back to drawing. In drawing, we use proportions to understand the relative size of one thing to another in our drawing. In a two-dimensional shape, there is a height and a width. You can measure these and you can understand how tall something is in proportion to how wide it is. The second part is measuring the size of objects in relation to each other, and this is where most people get themselves into trouble. But don't worry, if you're having problems with it, I've got an answer for you. But first, I want to tell you a secret. Now, are we alone? Okay, don't tell anyone else this. This is just between you and me. Now, the secret is... Actually, I talked about it already before, but I needed to get your attention because some of you weren't listening. The secret is we use ratios to measure the size of things relative to each other. Now, there is a trick to all this, and I'm going to show you what it is in a moment, so keep watching. As I said before, there are two main ways that you'll use proportions in your drawings. Now, I want to give you some examples of these to make sure you're really clear on what I'm talking about. The first thing we'll measure is the size of an individual object. Now, look at this photograph. In this photograph, you can see a window. There is a width and there is a height. We can measure that, and then it doesn't matter how big or small you draw that window in your drawing, you understand how high it is versus how wide it is, and you can always draw that window proportionally correct by having that measurement. Okay, now the second part of the problem is measuring the size of things relative to each other in the drawing. Now, here's an example. Here is a photograph. Now, you can see that here is a window which has a height and a width, just like the door. But now there's another element introduced. My head's in the middle of it. So now I've got a head which also has a height and a width. I can measure the height and the width of the window, and I know what the ratio of the window is. I can measure the height and the width of my head, and I know what that ratio is. But how does that help me get them combined so that I always make sure I draw my head and the window proportionally correct to each other? Well, what we do is we go back to our old friend ratios, and we understand that if the height of my head is a certain number and then the height of the window is a certain number, that gives me a ratio, and that means it's a measurement that I can use and always get that ratio correct. I can use this for every part of my drawing. And that's how simple it is to measure and understand proportions. Now, some of you might be sitting there thinking, I don't want to do maths. I don't want to measure ratios. I don't want to understand those things. Well, don't worry. I've got you covered. I've got something I'm going to share with you in a moment which would take all of that pain away. I'm going to share some tools with you that are going to help you with this, but before I do that, let's just explain a couple of scenarios, just to make it clear so you can decide which tool to use in which situation to get the best result. Some people love to use photo references, and it doesn't matter if you print the photo out or if you use the photo off a screen or a phone or anything like that. You have a flat image that you can use. Now the second way that people like to use references is to actually physically go to a location and do a drawing. Now photos are great because they allow you to capture a lot of information quickly on location, or you can find a photograph of something that you can't physically go and look at or see. And they're a great tool, and I use them all the time. Now when you're using photos, my favourite method of measuring proportions without having to worry about any sums or calculations is just to draw a grid. And if you use a grid, you can draw the grid on your photo or overlay it on the screen, and now you have a system of measurement. And you can draw the same grid on your piece of paper, and now you have a bunch of little squares. And each of these squares will contain a small amount of information from the drawing, and you can use that to measure the proportions. Now the second thing that will happen is if you're out in nature, like I am today, I love to come outside and sketch and draw. It's one of my favourite ways of really getting to know a subject and getting involved with things. You can't draw a grid on a person or a building. You have to be able to use your eye to do this, but just drawing by eye is really frustrating and difficult. Well, here's a tip that you can use. Now one of the ways you can do this is just like this. Take your pen, hold it up. Now let's say I'm going to measure against something. I can move my thumb down the pen, and using a straight arm I can use that to get a measurement. Now I know that this distance is the top of my object that I'm measuring. Now I can use that, and I can measure that against my paper. And you can use this to gauge the heights and the width of all the things that you're looking at, and you can measure against your drawing in the same way. And this is old school. This is how artists have done this for hundreds and hundreds of years, and you can do it too. While these techniques might take a little bit of getting used to, it might take a bit of practice for you to feel comfortable with these, I encourage you to go out and practice them and give it a go. Now which way is better? Whether you use a photo or whether you draw from life, it's fine. Both ways work. I use both of them all the time. There's no right or wrong to this. Try all the techniques and keep the ones that suit you best. And there you have it, and that's proportions. Now you know what they are, you know why they're important in your drawing, and you know how to measure them. If there's something you would like to see a video on, leave me a comment now. Now if you found this video helpful, and you know somebody else who's trying to learn to draw, why not share this video with them, and maybe it'll help them too. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you soon. Bye bye.